Hey beauties, I'm Meghan Norean, your resident womb witch and cyclical guide. I invite you on a journey with me through the landscape of cycle awareness, social justice, and spirituality as we follow the embodied path of womb, earth, and moon. Welcome to Lunarscape. Here's your cycle news for today. Last week on September 14th, a whistleblower account by a nurse, Dawn Wooten, who was working at the Irwin County Immigration Detention Center in Georgia in the United States, came out with an accusation of high rates of hysterectomies performed on Spanish-speaking immigrants. Now, this immigration detention center is owned and run by a for-profit private corporation, LaSalle Corrections. Now, I don't have the time to go into the problems of having a for-profit company running an immigration detention center, so we're just going to focus on the allegations that have come out. This report, written by Dawn Wooten, the nurse, was given by the human rights legal groups, the Government Accountability Project and Project South, and it had stated that there were poor safety precautions surrounding COVID and generally hazardous and unsanitary conditions. Now, what Dawn expressed in this report was that she had seen alarmingly high rates of hysterectomies, which is a surgery which part of the uterus or the reproductive organs are removed, and that these were being performed particularly on Spanish-speaking immigrants that did not gain explicit consent to have the surgery performed on them. She said that often they were just Googling things in Spanish to get their consent, which is not okay. She said that one woman was not properly anesthetized during a procedure and removed the wrong ovary, rendering her unable to have children. And another woman had a cyst drained and ultimately ended up with a hysterectomy instead. All done by an off-site gynecological doctor. So she says when she met all of these women who had had surgery, she thought it was an experimental concentration camp, and that it was like they were experimenting with their bodies, which also goes back to a ugly history in the U.S. of forced sterilization among Black slaves, growth of the gynecological area of medicine in the U.S. That is the dark history to it. So what is happening now? This has come to light, and in the last week there have been a lot of protests happening across the country calling to abolish ICE. And one of the women in the report, ICE says they accidentally or they tried to deport her just this past Wednesday, and Congress had to step in to get her to stay in the U.S. so that she could testify against what was happening in this facility. The main point person in Congress is Representative Pramila Jayapal, and 170 other U.S. lawmakers have signed a letter calling for an investigation by the Homeland Security Inspector General, and they are gathering reports against this facility and hoping that it gets shut down. But if you also want to voice your opinion, I have a link below where you can sign your own letter to Congress and let them know how you feel about ICE performing hysterectomies without explicit consent to Spanish-speaking immigrants. So for now, let's get into the podcast. I thought I would start this podcast by sharing a piece of my story as we are building trust with one another. I want to imagine we are sitting at a cafe and across the table from one another and sharing a cup of tea. So here is your gentle invitation to go ahead and make yourself a cup of tea and listen to my story. I will start by sharing where I am in my cycle. I am currently day 10 in my inner spring phase. My energy is gaining as I'm leading up to ovulation, and I've been doing more work, and a lot of creative projects are coming through, and I'm feeling more social and interacting with people about my work and about life, and feeling pretty good. I can share with you some of the descriptors just to get you an idea of who I am. I don't like to ascribe to labels, but they do tend to be helpful in understanding. So I will say I am an Aries, Sun and Moon, and a Gemini rising. I am an Enneagram 8, so that combination of my Aries energy and my Enneagram 8 brings a lot of passion and fire, and there will probably be, podcasts in the future with the expletive tag. I am an ENFP and a human design projector. I am also a wolf sleep chronotype. As I am recording this, it is currently 11:30 p.m., and you may hear crickets in the background, leaving that in there for the authenticity of my reality that I do most of my work in the evening and into the night. I will be, going to sleep probably around 2 o'clock is my usual time. I also want to recognize the privileges that I hold as a white, cisgendered woman who's also able-bodied and in a monogamous heterosexual relationship. I recognize all of these ways of being grant me many privileges in my life, and you will hear about some of those as I continue on with my story. So maybe you clicked on this podcast wondering, how in the world does someone go from being a Christian missionary to a pagan womb witch? Well, if you stay and listen, you will hear how it happened for me. Let's start at the beginning. I was born in the mid-'80s in a very small, we're talking like 400 people, small rural town in Pennsylvania in the United States. The community I grew up in was predominantly white, like 99% white. There was only one black girl in my school growing up, and very conservative, politically, spiritually, all around the whole package. And everybody that I knew was Christian. So I am the firstborn in my immediate family. I had a mom, dad, me, and a younger sister. When I was 2 years old, my father died in a car accident, and then later on, my mom got remarried and my stepdad came into the family household. So growing up, we always went to church every Sunday morning, but it didn't really permeate the rest of our lives. It was just our ritual, something that we did because my grandparents did it, my great-grandparents, and everybody in the community. It was just the thing you did on Sunday morning. And as I was growing up, my mother was not very strict. I had a lot of freedom to do and be who I wanted to be and what I wanted to do. And this did lead to early on getting into partying and drinking and early sexual experiences, which in themselves brought a whole lot of baggage about how I viewed myself, but we won't go into that here. Maybe I'll share another episode about that later. And then also at the age of 13, I reached menarche and got my first bleed. And I will also leave that there as well, and I will probably share about my period story later. I was always very active as a kid and growing up through school. I started dancing when I was the age of 3 and danced all through school, even on through college. I minored in dance. I was a competitive gymnast in middle school and played sports in high school. So I was very aware of my body through, all the activities I was doing, through the sexual experiences I was having, and started to butt heads a little bit with Christianity and the teachings that inherently I was supposed to believe that my body was sinful and a temptation for others, and it needed to be pure. So early on in high school, there was this battle between the idea of the pleasures of my body and the Christian conservative morals. So a turning point for me was one evening in high school. My mother took me over to our church, which is just right across the street, and we sat down in one of the pews together with the stained glass picture of Jesus dying on the cross lit up in front of us. And she had explained that she was really disappointed and upset in where my life was heading, the path that I had decided to take. And she became emotional and was crying, and which is unusual. So I knew this was pretty serious. And so I decided then to practice my faith more devoutly, to really take it seriously. I started reading the Bible at home. I started praying and was just really trying to be the daughter my mother wanted me to be. And I thought that meant being a good girl and being more devout in my Christian faith. So this continued on. I graduated from high school and I moved to the city of Pittsburgh to go to college. And when I started college, I knew that I wanted to continue this life of being, within my Christian faith. And I quickly joined a few groups on campus, Christian organizations on campus, and started gaining close friendships and community with those people there. So it was the spring break of my freshman year. I decided to go on a short-term mission trip. While on this mission trip, I really fell in love with being in service to other people and helping them in whatever way I could. That started a domino effect of me getting involved in mission work. So the summer after my freshman year, I spent the whole summer on the mission field. After my sophomore year, I did the same. After my junior year, I did the same. And it was at that time I decided that I didn't really care to pursue a career within my degree, which was architectural studies, and I decided I wanted to be a missionary and move overseas. So when I graduated from college, I started looking everywhere in the world where I wanted to live, what organizations were working and doing mission work in these different countries, and nothing really aligned. No doors really opened, and I felt kind of stuck, like it wasn't my time yet to leave. And I had been volunteering with an organization in Pittsburgh as a dance instructor, and they had offered me a full-time position to come and work for them. And so I signed on for a 3-year contract to work in Pittsburgh with this organization. So I moved from the college area of Pittsburgh to the inner city, the predominantly Black neighborhood, which actually has become quite gentrified since I left Pittsburgh, but at that time it was still quite predominantly Black and a poorer area in the city. So I started working at this organization with a lot of the things they were doing wrong there. The one thing that I really connected with was living in the community that we were working with. So that was a strong emphasis for this organization. And so I moved into the neighborhood. I was, living with the people that I was working with and building community together with these families. So after the end of my 3 years there, that idea of living alongside and building community with people was a really strong calling, strong pull in my life. So I again knew that I wanted to move overseas and started looking again at different places, countries, and organizations, but now I had more of a focus that I really wanted to be with an organization that lived with the people they were working with, not to be, this removed entity where, the rich foreigners, the rich white people live in these fancy, apartments and go into the poorer communities and do their mission work. And I knew I didn't want to do that. I wanted to live in the area with the people. So I had come across a short-term mission trip that was going to India and going to be teaching dance to women who were in an aftercare home from being trafficked. And so I went to India for the first time at the end of 2009, and I really fell in love with it. It's one of those places you usually either love or hate immediately, and I loved it immediately. So I came back to the States after this trip and contacted all the organizations I knew who were doing incarnational, living among the people they were working with, and doing that within India. Right away, I got a call from one organization that had said that they had been praying for a single female to join their team. And me, being a single female at the time, thought it was divine intervention that I was meant to be on this team. So I quit my job in Pittsburgh and packed my bags, and I left by February of 2010 and went on my way to living and working in India. And it was within the first 6 weeks of my life in India that another big turning point came. I had been staying with an older widowed woman in her little house in the slum, and it was about 11 feet by 7 feet. Just this one little room that the both of us lived in for those weeks. She gave up her bed for me. I slept on the single bed, and she slept on the floor beside me. And every night she would go to her ashram. She was a very devout Hindu woman, and I started to see in the community that she was the person everybody would go to when they had a problem. You know, if a kid came home from school and their parents weren't home, they'd come to her house and she'd find them food. If a woman was beaten by her husband, they would come to her and cry on her shoulder. If somebody was having financial difficulties, they'd come to her and she'd try and figure out a way that they could, get a job or find funds somehow. So as I am observing her throughout these 6 weeks of living with her, I started to realize that she is a lot more like Jesus than any of the Christians I had ever met. And it didn't fit in my understanding at that time. How could this woman, who is a very devout Hindu, be like Jesus? That just did not make sense to me at that point. And that's when a lot of questions started to arise for me. So moving ahead a couple years to 2013, I was riding my bike. I was leaving the community that I had been living in, still working with this mission organization, the same one I went there with. And I was riding my bike. And as I was riding, someone called me on the phone. So I stopped and pulled over and answered the phone. As I was talking on the phone, I noticed that a man had also stopped riding his bicycle and was parked it on the other side of the road and was staring at me. Now, this wasn't unusual. I got stared at a lot and learned how to ignore most of, the stares that I got. But I did notice and recognize that he was there. So I ended the phone call and got back on my bike and was driving again and noticed that he did too. Got on his bicycle and came up beside me. And I, tried to get away from him, going faster, going slower. And at one point, he yelled over to me to get my attention. So I turned to look at him, and he had pulled his pants down to expose himself to me. And I freaked out. I lost it. I yelled and screamed at him, and I rode my bike off really fast, and I went into all these side lanes and everything to try and get away from him, which thankfully I did. I had a spiritual direction like 1 or 2 days after this incident happened, and as I was telling my spiritual director, I was having a really difficult time talking to God about this incident, and I couldn't pray about it, and I didn't know what was happening. And she said, I find it really interesting that you aren't able to talk to God about it because you are always using male pronouns to describe God. And my mind exploded. It had never occurred to me that I was equating God with male. It was just so ingrained that that's what it was. I had no critical lens to see how I was understanding God when I talked about God. And so this was sort of like the foundation was ripped underneath me. And I started to question everything. If this is what I was taught, if this is how I understood God, and now those understandings no longer fit into what I believed, because I didn't really believe that God was male. How did I get there? And now, what do I believe? And so that was the beginning of my dark night of the soul. This dark period lasted for about 2 years and went through some pretty scary places of questioning and not knowing who I was anymore, not knowing pretty much anything. I scraped everything down of what I had been taught and realized at the bottom there was nothing left, and thought I was an atheist for quite a long time, thinking that there was no God at all. Luckily, at this time, I had enrolled in a dance movement therapy certification course, and that really was my connection back in understanding, the sacredness of my body and the way that it moves, and just the power that it had to help me in my healing process. So, through this deeper connection with my body, I also started to become more aware of my cyclical nature and my womb space. As I started learning more, I had a friend send me an article about an organization who was giving out menstrual cups to people in India to help them stay in school and get educated and raise awareness on period poverty. And my friend sent this to me because she knew that I had been a cup user for many years. I started when I was in college, and I immediately started doing research and decided to start a business making sustainable menstrual products and doing menstrual health education in the area that I was living in at the time. So all this coming to a more mystical understanding where I was beginning to see all of the religions and spiritual paths headed towards the same direction and all having this at the core value of love, even if it was covered and masked in so many ways you couldn't tell what it was. At the core, if you stripped everything down, it was love. And so I applied to go to the Living School with the Center for Action and Contemplation in the US. And I was accepted and studied there for 2 years on Christian mysticism. At the same time, I also began my 500-hour yoga training. And so I was sort of combining my two worlds, the life of my Christian faith, and this life of me living in India, surrounded in this Hindu context. And so I was trying to meld the two together at that time. And a little later on, I also went on my first trekking, my first hike through the hills of England and Scotland, and really fell in love with being on the land. And there was a mystical experience of being on the land of my ancestors as well. I felt a really strong connection. My ancestry being from England, Scotland, Ireland, Germany, and a spattering of Norwegian. But my first trip to the UK and hiking and walking the hills, I felt a really deep connection with the land. In 2017, I had decided that the mystical path I was following no longer aligned with the organization that I had been with for the past 7 years, living and working in India. And so I decided to leave that organization, but to stay in India because also at that time I fell in love with an Indian man and wanted to develop that relationship that ultimately led to us getting married. So decided to stay in India, but was becoming very aware of what it meant for me to be a white American in this Indian Hindu context. So I found some people online, specifically No White Saviors on Instagram when they first started becoming active, and really started analyzing what my role was, what things I had done in those past 7 years, and the harm I may have caused in being there, and the ways that I thought I knew better, and revealing this huge white savior complex that I had that that I was taught from my Christian upbringing and all of the mission trips that I had went on and the organizations I worked with. And it was another one of these turning points of realizing that everything I had thought and worked for was, again, and not so much a lie in this way, but it was deceptive, that this white savior complex was the underlying, energy that was pushing this work forward, but nobody was talking about it. And so I really went through a process in myself. Ultimately, I decided that I needed to shut the business down. It led me to deciding that I did not want to live in India anymore, and it led me to the pagan spiritual path of my ancestors. So I began to understand more about my ancestors and their pre-Christian roots, really peeling back those layers that Christianity had implemented onto my ancestors' understanding that and their spirituality that came out of the land that they were living on. And the more I researched about the practices that they had, and seeing that they were very cyclical in nature, this connection with the land naturally brought them to a cyclical view of the world and how it moved through the seasons, which very much aligned with the work I had been doing with my own menstrual cycle and understanding it as being, having a very cyclical worldview, seeing through the lens of my menstrual cycle. So all of these things were synchronizing together, this understanding of the pagan, cyclical, earthly, earth-based spirituality. And I had found the Red School and started working in menstruality and understanding the menstrual cycle as this spiritual path as well. And so these are all synchronizing and coming together, and was feeling really aligned with where I am in my life. So there right there is how I really embraced the label of a womb witch, and I started doing a lot of practices around my cycle that were, pagan and witchy in nature, doing tarot readings and doing spell work, doing rituals with my blood, with the earth along the wheel of the year. And so I've been with those practices for the last 2 years and still feel like, the little baby witch, but I am fully embracing it because it really feels true to who I am at this moment, and true to my ancestry and the decolonization process that I went through. Now, I am currently talking to you from my parents' house in the United States, as I left India at the end of last year in 2019 and thought I was not going to be moving back. And then the pandemic happened, and I have been separated, apart from my partner, my love, for the past 9 months. And so I am now on my way to moving back to India to be with him until his green card gets processed and we can move back to the United States. So knowing that I don't feel connected to the land of India anymore, and thinking I would never live there again, but knowing that I want to be with my partner and that's the only place we can be together right now. So I am holding a lot of complexities and paradoxes and nuances of what it means for me to be back in India, as I identify as a pagan womb witch that doesn't really fit into that context. And as the white American, trying not to perpetuate the white savior complex and a lot of the harm that has been done in India because of colonization. So that's the space that I am in currently right now as I am talking to you. And I'm so grateful that you have sat and listened to a piece of my story. And I would love to hear more about you and hear your story. Who are you? What are the pieces of your life that make you who you are? And I would love for you to share that if you come and join the Sacred Cycles Coven. It's a free online group that I run, and I would just love to build community with you there. So you can get the link to join me and many other wonderful magical beings there in the show notes. So I hope you have a wonderful day or night, whatever time it is, and hope you tune in for the next episode.